may be seated. And if you have a Bible, I want to invite you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 14. If you want to use the Bible that's in the chair or the pew in front of you, it's on page 820. And Matthew 14 is where we're going to be. And we're coming to a really important moment in Matthew's gospel. We've been walking through the gospel according to Matthew really over the course of this whole year. And what we're coming to today is profound because we see people respond in faith to Jesus. Now, last week, we saw a couple of examples as we went to the end of chapter 13 and beginning of 14. We saw a couple of pictures of rejection of Jesus. We saw what opposition to Jesus looks like. But today, we get the opportunity to see just the opposite. Today, we don't see rejection or opposition or apathy, but today we see faith. We see worship. We see this amazing proclamation that truly Jesus is the Son of God. And it's a really important moment in Matthew's gospel because so far we've seen that truth revealed in a number of ways that Jesus is the Son of God. We saw the Father speak this at Jesus' baptism. He said, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased." We saw the devil question this whenever he was tempting Jesus. The devil said, "Well, if you're really the Son of God, then you'll..." We saw the demons proclaim this as Jesus was coming to a demon-possessed man. They said, "Oh, Son of God, what are you coming to do with us at this moment?" But for the first time in Matthew's gospel, we see people proclaim this truth. We see the disciples come to recognize that Jesus is the Son of God. And I think Matthew has recorded this for us so that we might have the same response. So that along with the disciples, we today might recognize that Jesus truly is the Son of God, that we would respond in faith and in worship of him. And so today, as we look at this passage and we see a couple of well-known miracles by Jesus, I want us to see a few invitations that I want to lay before you, inviting us to come and recognize this great reality, that truly this is the Son of God, and how we can respond in faith and in worship. So I want to read our passage for us this morning, which is Matthew chapter 14. We're going to start in verse 13 and go all the way to the end of the chapter in verse 36. Matthew writes, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' But Jesus said, 'They need not go away. You give them something to eat.' They said to him, 'We only have 5 loaves here and 2 fish.' And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. The disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat, by this time, was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It is a ghost.' And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.' And Peter answered him, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.' He said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, 'O you of little faith, why did you doubt?' And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.' And when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. Now, our passage today picks up right where last week's passage left off. You might remember that last week we were looking at the beginning of chapter 14, and we saw that John the Baptist was beheaded, and that the disciples of John came and brought word to Jesus that John had been beheaded. And so we see here at the beginning of our passage that Jesus withdraws to be by himself. Now, there might have been a couple of motivations for this. Jesus might have been withdrawing from the region where this madman who is violent is ruling over so that he is somewhat out of harm's way, being attacked or persecuted like John was. But perhaps there was also maybe a personal element to this. I mean, Jesus has just learned that his cousin, his close friend, his partner in ministry, if you will, has just been killed. Jesus, who is truly God, is also truly man. We know that he has real emotions, that he feels things, that maybe at this point, there's a time of being tired, maybe a time of grief, maybe he just wants to be alone. So he withdraws as he often did by himself, but the crowds won't let him be alone. We see that the crowds follow him, and when they reach him, it says in verse 14, when he saw that great crowd on the shore, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I want some alone time and people invade that time and that space, I don't always react with compassion. Like sometimes I know I've got some work that I need to get done, and so I make clear to my boys that I need some alone time, I need some quiet time, and eventually at some point they come and kind of invade that quiet time, and I don't always respond with great compassion. I don't know if you can relate to me at all. Thankfully, Jesus can't relate to me. Jesus responds with compassion. That even in a time whenever maybe he was grieving, tired, wanting to be alone, when he sees the crowds, and he remembers that they are like sheep without a shepherd, he's filled with such compassion for them that he begins to act. He begins to minister to them. He begins to heal them and meet their needs. And this healing, this ministry takes a while. And if you've been around church, you've read the Bible much before, you know this miracle that's about to take place. There's a large crowd there and the day is getting late. So the disciples come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, it's getting late. We're kind of out in the wilderness. Why don't we send people to the towns where they can get some food? Now, I think we should give the disciples some credit. Sometimes we can read the gospel accounts and think that the disciples were foolish or misguided or totally missed the point. But here, I think this makes sense. I mean, they seem to care about the needs of the crowd. They're trying to have some foresight that people are hungry. They need to be fed. And so they said, let's send them away. And notice what Jesus says in response. He says in verse 16, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. This is an interesting response by Jesus. He tells them they don't need to go away. I want you to feed them. Now, does Jesus know that they don't have enough food? I mean, does Jesus know that the disciples on their own can't possibly feed all these people? I don't know if you've ever tried to feed a large crowd. Today, my wife's been preparing lunch for our quarterly members meeting, preparing for, maybe hundreds. And that was a lot of grocery shopping, a lot of prepping, waking up early this morning, getting stuff in the oven. Like to prepare for a large group of people, it takes a lot of work. The disciples haven't prepared anything. There's thousands of people in the crowd. Why does Jesus tell them, you give them something to eat? Well, I think there might be a couple of reasons. For one, I think maybe Jesus wants the disciples to begin to adopt his mindset when it comes to ministry. Jesus' mindset was that he was there to meet the needs of the people. That when Jesus even wanted to be alone, but the crowds were able to find him, Jesus had compassion on them. And he had such compassion on them that it compelled him to act and to heal and to meet the people's needs. And I think Jesus wants his disciples to begin to understand, this is my plan for you, that you would be people, my people, who would go out and meet others' needs. That you would be so compelled by compassion that you would take the initiative and meet people where they are. That you would care for people and you would even be willing for it to inconvenience you. You think about Jesus in this whole example of him being possibly wanting to be alone, but yet being compelled by compassion to meet the needs of others. It reminds me of what Paul writes in Philippians chapter 2, that the mind of Jesus is to not look to his own interests, but to the interests of others. And Paul tells us in Philippians 2 that this mind that is in Jesus Christ is now yours, those of you who have trusted in Jesus. This is the mindset that you are to have. You are to be God's people marked with humility, of thinking others more than you think about yourselves, of thinking about the needs of others and being willing to say, God has called me to meet those needs. So I think Jesus wants to put an impetus on the disciples to see that their call to ministry, their call to be on mission for God is to meet the needs of people. But they recognize that they don't have the resources in this moment. They tell Jesus, look, we've only got a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. That's not even enough to feed our small group. How could it possibly feed all of these people? And Jesus says, I want you to bring the bread and the fish to me. And why does Jesus do this? Why take the small amount that the disciples have? I mean, Jesus probably could have just called down food from heaven, miraculously made food just appear. Why does he take the small amount from the disciples and begin to multiply it? Well, see, I think he wants them to understand that just as they are called to go and do this ministry of meeting people's needs, caring for people right where they are, he also wants them to understand that that's not something they can do on their own. That on their own, they are insufficient for this task, but he is sufficient. That on their own, that this task is impossible, but with God and with Jesus, all things are possible. And so he invites them to say, bring me what you have that we might meet the need that is here. So here's the first invitation that I want to offer to you this morning. As we see that Jesus is the Son of God, we see that he has all that we need, so trust him with your resources. Jesus has all that we need. Maybe it'd be more accurate to say Jesus is all that we need. So trust him with what he has given you. Again, I think Jesus is making an example here of having them bring in the small amount, whatever they had at their disposal. And in his hands, it begins to multiply. As he thanks God for it, as he blesses it, it begins to multiply and it begins to feed all of these people because he is showing them that when you trust in me, not in your own power, not in your own resources, but when you trust me so much that you bring your resources to me and allow me to do what I want with them, to carry out my mission with them, then I will fulfill my purposes through the little that you have. And friends, we might look around our city and see the brokenness and the hurting and the needs in San Francisco, and it might feel like an overwhelming task. It might feel like we're trying to feed 5,000 plus people with just a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. We might look at the world and see all the people that have not yet heard about Jesus, the unreached and the unengaged, and we might seem like an insurmountable task. And I believe in this story, Jesus is speaking to us saying, this is your job. Don't tell the people to go somewhere else. Don't tell them to go have their needs met by some other organization or some other group. This is your call as my people. You feed them. You give them something to eat. You meet their physical needs. You meet their spiritual needs. And we look and we say, well, God, look at how little we have. There's no way we could fix all the problems in our city. There's no way we could reach all the people around the world. And I think God is saying, trust me with what you have. If you will trust me with the things that I have given you, if you will allow me to use them for my purposes, you will see it multiplied in my hands. You will see it used for my purposes and my mission. So I want to encourage you this morning. He has all that you need. He has all that he needs to carry out his mission. So would you trust him with your resources? Would you bring to God your finances? Would you bring to God your time? Would you bring to God the resources that he has given you and allow him to use them? And part of this, I do think, is investing in the church that God has established in a local church. I do think it is good to invest your money and your time and your resources within the body of Christ so that it can be used for the mission that God has for us. But when I say trust God with your resources and bring them to him, I don't just mean bring them to the church. I mean, your home as it is used, your salary as it is used, your free time as it is used, even outside the exact things and programs and events of the church, allow God to use them to reach your neighbor, to reach your coworker, to reach that person who is in need. Jesus is looking at us as his people and he is saying, don't tell them to go find something else. Look to the interests of others more than to yourself and trust that I have given you and I will continue to give you what you need. That's what happens in this story, that he is able to multiply in such a way that it says in verse 20 that all ate and were satisfied. But this wasn't just some appetizer. This wasn't just to hold them over until they could get to the village, that they all ate and were full. And not only that, but they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. I don't think that's a coincidence. Each disciple gets their own basket full after all this is done. As if Jesus is letting them know, trust me with what you have, and not only will I satisfy the needs of the people, but I will also continue to sustain you. As you look at your own situation and your own resources, it might feel tough to bring it to God. Maybe finances are tight. Maybe it doesn't feel like you have a lot of free time, but God is saying, if you will entrust it to me, not only will I use it to carry out my mission, bring satisfaction to many others, but I will also continue to sustain you. Jesus has all that we need, so trust him with our resources. Now, at this point, Jesus sends the disciples on ahead. He dismisses the crowds. He sends the disciples on ahead, and now he is going to be by himself alone again, going up on the mountainside to pray. And as it got late in the night, the disciples were on the boat, and they were fighting a bit of a storm. It says in verse 24, by this time, the boat was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. Now, we've seen the disciples caught in a storm already in Matthew's gospel. You might remember back to chapter 8, whenever they were caught in such a storm that they were fearing for their lives. Maybe this wasn't quite as bad of a storm. Doesn't seem like some of the language means that their lives felt threatened, but it does seem to be that this wasn't an easy sail. I mean, whenever it says that the wind was against them, that the waves are beating against the boat, it sounds like this was a difficult time. And this time, as compared to chapter 8, Jesus isn't in the boat with them. Like last time, Jesus was right there sleeping, and they could go wake him up and say, Rabbi, don't you care that we're about to perish? But this time, Jesus isn't in the boat. And friends, there might be times in your life when you're going through something, and it doesn't feel like God is right there in your boat with you. There might be times whenever, in difficult moments that it feels like he's nearby, and sometimes in difficult times, it feels like he is far away. I just want to remind you, as we see in this story, that even as Jesus is not in the boat, he is present there with his disciples. And not only is he nearby, but he is in control of the whole situation. That our God is sovereign. And this is the second invitation that I want to offer you today. Because Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus is sovereign over all. So trust him in every season. Jesus is sovereign over all circumstances, all situations. So trust him in every season of your life. Now, we've seen Jesus' sovereignty on display, as I mentioned already, back in chapter 8, at least his sovereignty over nature and over storms. We saw in that instance that Jesus just woke up and he rebuked the storm, and the storm ceased, the winds and the waves died down. This time I want to point out something new that we see here that shows Jesus' sovereignty. A way that helps us to be reminded to trust him in every season. That as the disciples look out on the water and they see Jesus walking, they say, well, that must be a ghost. And listen to how Jesus responds. Verse 27, immediately Jesus spoke to them saying, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. Now it's kind of interesting here. The words that Jesus uses, it is I, it's translated there, it is I, and that's a good translation. But if you were to go look at the original language that Matthew wrote it in, it's the Greek words, ego eimi, which in the Greek translation, it could be translated, it is I, or it could be translated, I am. And some scholars read this and they hear a divine echo, that just as God had spoken to Moses thousands of years before, we read about in Exodus chapter 3 that Moses asks a question, if I'm supposed to go into Egypt and tell them I've been sent by God, who should I say sent me? And God tells him, I am has sent you. This is the name Yahweh or Jehovah. He is the great I am. And some people say that as Jesus is calming the fears of the disciples here, he is identifying himself. But he's not just identifying himself by saying, don't worry, it's me, Jesus, not a ghost. But he is also speaking in such a way to cause them to know that he is divine, that he is the great I am. What you need to know in every season of life, that your Lord and Savior is not just a man who died and rose again. That is true. But he is also truly God. He is the great I am. He is over every circumstance, every storm, every situation, so you can trust him in every season. I don't know what kind of season you're going through in your life right now. Maybe you're in the midst of what feels like a storm. Maybe you're in the midst of a time where there is struggles both personally or relationally. Maybe there's been a loss of a loved one or a loss of a job or loss of a relationship. You might be in the midst of a storm and it feels like God is not in control, or maybe it feels like he's not nearby, but this story gives us the account of Jesus saying, I am the great I am. I am here over this situation. Do not fear. So we can respond in faith. And that's actually what Peter does in this story. You know, Peter's usually the first one to speak up. A lot of times that gets him in trouble. A lot of times he kind of puts his foot in his mouth, but sometimes it works out in his favor. Peter here, he shows a great deal of faith. In fact, our translation says that he says to Jesus, if it's you, but a lot of translations would say the better way to think about that is since it is you. He's saying to Jesus, since that is you on the water, allow me to come to you. Allow me to walk on the water to you. So Jesus commands him, invites him to come to him. So Peter walks on water. Always wondered what that felt like, what that was like. Like, did he sink just ankle deep, or did he stay on top of all the water the whole time? Well, for the most of the time he did, but we see that as he walked towards Jesus, something happens. It says in verse 30 that when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? I want to take just a moment and speak about doubt and faith. Because as we have this invitation to trust Jesus in every season, I think it's important to understand what it means to have faith and where doubt comes from. When Jesus says here that Peter is of little faith, and he asks him, why did you doubt? The word for doubt there is really an idea of being double-minded. The language of doubt there is really like you're trying to walk in two different directions at the same time, or like you're trying to serve two different masters. Jesus has already warned us about the danger of that. And I think it's so important because so many times I think when we hear that phrase that Peter was of little faith, we think that means that he needed to muster up more faith. And a lot of times I think we think that in our lives, we need to have more faith, as if we can muster up more faith. But one of the things I think the Bible makes clear, and Jesus is even showing us in this language of doubt being double-minded, is that when it comes to faith in the Bible, it's not so much about the measure of your faith, but the object of your faith. It's not so much about how much faith you can muster up, but rather, what is your faith in? Peter was not one of little faith here because he just couldn't muster up enough faith in Jesus. Peter was of little faith because he had become double-minded. That as he took his eyes off Jesus, began to look at his circumstances and look at the storm and the wind around him, that he became double-minded in his faith. And that's when he begins to sink. Friends, when I tell you need to trust in every season and you hear this language of little faith, I don't want you to feel a burden on you as if you just always need to be trying to have more faith. Rather, I just want you to consider, what is your faith in? What is the object of your faith? Have you become double-minded in your faith? Have you placed some of your faith in God, but then also some in your own abilities? Have you trusted God with some of your resources, but you're going to make sure to hold on to some so that you can be in charge of that? The question is, where is your faith? Who is your faith in? Peter, he becomes double-minded in his faith, and that's when he begins to sink. But notice what happens. As soon as he calls out to Jesus, Jesus immediately is there to grab him and to pull him up. That when the doubts come in, when you become double-minded in your faith, don't start to beat yourself up and say, oh my gosh, God's gonna be so disappointed in me. Let me strengthen my faith again, and then I know he'll be there for me. Let me make sure that I improve my life or start to do things better, and then I know that he'll be there for me. No, whenever you see doubt arise in your mind, simply call out to him. When you feel the temptation to begin to place your faith in something else, simply call out to him and he will be there to rescue you. As we were just singing, he is faithful even when we are unfaithful. His faithfulness is so great that he is right there as soon as we are calling out to him. So he helps Peter back up. He reminds us of what it looks like to have faith in him. And he and Peter go back to the boat. And as they get back on the boat, the storm calms, the wind and the waves cease. And it says in verse 33, those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. Again, this is a powerful moment in Matthew's gospel. We hear those words. We speak about Jesus as the Son of God a lot. So maybe it would kind of seem not that profound to us, but for them to proclaim this truth, for them to worship Jesus and to say that truly he is the Son of God is a powerful moment of realization. This is the time when they worship him, and this is the example for us that we are to worship Jesus. That what we've been talking about trusting him with our resources and trusting him in every season, it's all about worship. And so many times we are tempted to worship other people or other things. It shows up by what we put our resources into, what we put our faith into. But here in these moments, we're reminded that Jesus alone is worthy of our worship. And I want to take just a moment and consider, what does it mean to worship God or worship Jesus? What does worship of Jesus entail? I know that could sound like a really maybe simple question, but I think it's worth considering. Because sometimes I think we get this impression that to worship God means we bring him something. That to worship God means we bring him something that we have to give him. And it's true, I have been saying we do need to trust God with our resources and trust him in every season. But it's not because we need to give those things to God. It's because we are recognizing that he already has them all. You see, there's an important thing that I think we need to understand, that worship of God doesn't mean that we're bringing him anything that he needs, but rather worship of God is recognizing that he is all that we need. There's this important teaching from Paul to the people of Athens. It's in Acts chapter 17, and Paul is noticing all the idols around the city of Athens. And he starts to speak to the people about the worship of all these gods. And he basically says, you guys are just giving all these fake gods all these things that you think they need. But the true God doesn't need anything. In fact, this is what he says in Acts 17. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. You see, what Paul is saying is worship of God is not bringing something to God that he needs. Rather, it is recognizing that he is all that we need. And I want to make this point clear because so many times I think we can think of worship as having to do something rather than simply recognizing something, that truly Jesus is the Son of God. Having this realization that truly he alone is the bread of life who can satisfy. Truly he alone is the one who can heal, and that is how we worship him. In fact, after the disciples worship him, this is what we see from the people in the region. That as Jesus comes into this region, the people are trusting that he is the only one who can heal them. It says that the men of that place recognized him, verse 35, they sent around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick, and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well. This is what it looks like to worship Jesus, to recognize that healing is found in him. So my final invitation for you this morning is to recognize that as the Son of God, Jesus is worthy of our worship. So come to him and be healed. Again, sometimes I think we might expect it to say Jesus is worthy of our worship, so do something for him. Bring him something. But I want to present to you this morning, the way we worship God, the way we worship Jesus is to recognize that he is all that we need. To recognize the the brokenness in our own lives, the sinfulness in our own lives, the imperfection in our own lives, and to come to him to believe that he alone can satisfy, that he alone can bring the healing that we need. He alone can bring the healing for the loneliness that we feel. He alone can bring the healing for the unworthiness that we feel. He alone can bring healing for all these things because he was wounded in our place. The Bible says that he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, wounded for our sins. And upon him was the chastisement, really the punishment that brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed. Because he is not only the Son of God, but because he had compassion on us as lost people. He did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but took the form of a servant. He became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. God has now highly exalted him. He has the name above every name, and he alone is worthy of our worship. This is the way that we worship as we come to the table this morning. We come to the table confessing our sins, confessing our brokenness, confessing our need for healing, and saying that Jesus alone can satisfy, that he alone is the bread of life, that he alone can meet every need. Truly, Jesus is the Son of God. So trust him with all your resources. Trust him in every season and worship him. Would you pray with me?